The year was 1934, and the quiet room in Virginia Beach seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the Atlantic rolled in slow, heavy strokes, each wave brushing the shore like a warning whispered from another world. Inside, a single lamp cast a warm circle of light over a desk scattered with notes, readings, and unanswered questions. Edgar Cayce, known by those who followed him as the sleeping prophet, lay back on a modest couch, his hands resting gently on his chest. His breathing slowed, softened, and then slipped into that familiar rhythm that signaled his descent into the unseen. The air shifted. Those who had witnessed this moment before said it always felt like the threshold between two worlds briefly thinned, as if the hidden realm leaned closer, listening. Gladys Davis, the faithful stenographer who recorded every word, sat with her pencil hovering above the pad. She had learned long ago that when Cayce crossed into trance, she must not blink too long, must not let a single syllable escape her. A faint breeze, though no window was open, stirred the curtains. Then Cayce's voice changed. It was still his, and yet not his. Deeper, slower, weighted with something ancient, as though old truths were pushing through his lips in search of form. "I perceive a figure," he murmured. "A builder of towers?" The words floated in the room like drifting smoke. Gladys leaned forward, her heart quickening. Cayce's eyes remained shut, but his face had taken on the stillness of carved stone as the vision unfolded through him. "He rises among the people," Cayce continued, "not by birthright, not by the sword, but by the will of the many." Through the fragile silence, the image of this mysterious builder grew clearer. A man wreathed in the glint of gold, his silhouette glowing against the flicker of flame. He stood elevated above crowds, above rivals, above the ordinary, constructing monuments to his own ascent. Towers of gleaming opulence, rising like exclamation marks across distant skylines. And yet, beneath those towers, nothing but sand. Shifting, slipping, restless with the weight placed upon it. "The sand moves," Cayce whispered, as if watching a structure tilt. "He builds higher and higher, but the foundation will not hold." Gladys' pencil scratched across paper, struggling to keep pace with the torrent of images. She sensed that this was no symbolic meditation. Cayce was seeing something, a life, a destiny, perhaps even a warning meant for a time far beyond their own. "He is a merchant at heart," Cayce intoned, "wearing the crown of commerce, not royalty. His power is forged in gold, in influence, in the trade of promises, and the craft of persuasion. A merchant crowned as a king, a builder acclaimed as a savior, a man whose voice," Cayce said, "would echo across a nation like a trumpet blast awakening the forgotten. He speaks for those who feel unseen," Cayce continued, "for those who believe the world has passed them by. He becomes their champion, their vessel, their symbol." His words carried a peculiar mixture of admiration and foreboding, as though the man he described was both a product of his times and a catalyst of something deeper, something more dangerous. Yet Cayce's face suddenly tensed, a shadow crossing his brow. "But in the pursuit of his own making, he loses the thread of spirit," he murmured. "He chases the glimmer of gold, not the light of truth. And so the sand shifts." The room seemed to contract around those words. Even the lamplight flickered, as if responding to the tension in the air. Gladys barely breathed. Cayce's voice dropped further. "The people who raised him up will turn, not by force of foreign hand, not by the weapons of his enemies, but by the weight of what lies hidden, the truth beneath the tower." A pause, heavy, electric. "He shall be judged," Cayce whispered, "not by kings or courts, but by the very voices that once called his name with hope." And then, as if the unseen realm grew closer still, Cayce's tone softened into something almost mournful. "His fall will not be swift. It will be a long unwinding, a tower unraveling thread by thread, until the sand claims what was built upon it." For a moment, nothing else came, only Cayce's breathing, slow and tidal, filling the room. But then, unexpectedly, his voice returned, not with despair, but with something else, something that felt like a lantern being lit. "And when the tower falls," he said, "a presence stirs in the smoke." Gladys' eyes widened. She had not expected the prophecy to continue beyond the collapse of the builder. But Cayce spoke with new clarity, as though shifting his gaze from the ruins to something emerging from the ashes. "I see another," he whispered, "not draped in gold, not crowned by men, but steady, enduring. A figure who rises not from triumph, but from the wounds of the people." A ripple of warmth passed through the room. The atmosphere, heavy moments earlier, now felt strangely illuminated, as if the prophecy itself carried its own quiet dawn. "She begins in silence," Cayce murmured, "in the shadows where grief is carried, where burdens are shared. Her steps are gentle, but the light within her is unyielding." And then, in a tone edged with awe, "She is the mender." The pencil trembled in Gladys' hand. Cayce's breathing deepened. The trance pulled him further, but the vision had already been cast. One figure rising on towers of sand, and another rising from the heart of the earth itself. Two destinies intertwined, one built on ambition, one built on compassion, one destined to fall, one destined to heal. Cayce's final words before silence returned were barely audible, like the fading echo of a far-off bell. "The age of towers is ending, and the age of renewal begins with her." The lamplight steadied. The room exhaled, and Gladys, staring at the pages she had filled, realized she had captured something that did not belong to their time. Alone but to a world still waiting, still struggling, still searching for the figure who would one day step out from the ruins and carry the light forward. Decades slipped by like pages in a book, turning themselves to couch, and Virginia Beach grew old. The lamp was replaced. The sound of the Atlantic never changed, but the world beyond that quiet room transformed. Beyond anything Edgar, Cayce, or Gladys could have imagined, towers rose. In cities that once knew only modest skylines, glass and steel began to pierce the clouds. Names were etched in gold atop buildings, so tall they cast shadows over entire neighborhoods. Wealth concentrated in glittering vertical monuments, each one a statement, each one a declaration, that ambition could be measured in stories and floors. Somewhere between those towers and the restless ground beneath them, the prophecy began to feel less like a distant riddle and more like a whisper lodged in the bones of the age. For most people, Cayce's words lay buried, filed away in archives, tucked into forgotten papers, read only by a handful of curious researchers. But history has a way of circling back on itself, and sometimes, what seems forgotten is merely waiting for the right moment to reappear. In the early years of the new century, the world watched as a very particular kind of figure emerged into view. A builder whose name was inseparable from towers. A merchant whose brand was not only a business, but an empire of image and influence. He did not come from palaces or royal bloodlines. He came from the marketplace, from deals and negotiations, from the glittering intersection of wealth and spectacle. He was not handed a throne. He stepped onto a stage. And when he spoke, millions listened. He spoke to the frustrated, the overlooked, the ones who felt that the promises of progress had somehow passed them by. To some, he was a joke. To others, a wake-up call. To many, he became a vessel for their anger and their hopes. A lightning rod for everything they felt the world had ignored. He said he would rebuild, restore, lift up, protect, and slowly, almost impossibly, the chant of his name began to ripple through stadiums, arenas, streets. The images carried by cameras and screens showed crowds with eyes burning not just with admiration, but with the fierce loyalty of those who had been hungry for anyone to say, "I see you." It was here, in this strange convergence of spectacle and desperation, that the outline from Cayce's vision began to flicker at the edges of the present. A merchant crowned not by birth, but by the will of the many. A builder of towers, risen high above the crowd. A figure wrapped in gold, in fire, in controversy. He was adored. He was despised. He divided hearts almost as soon as he claimed them. Some saw him as a savior from a corrupt order. Others saw him as the embodiment of that corruption. But regardless of which side one stood on, no one could deny that he had become what the prophecy described, a man whose reputation grew larger than the man himself, a symbol more than a singular life. And then, something subtle began to shift. The chants remained, but the tone changed. The headlines multiplied, not with triumphs, but with accusations, investigations, hearings. Courtrooms replaced arenas. Testimonies took the place of rallies. The same screens that once showed cheering crowds now showed stern faces, sworn oaths, and questions that cut to the bone. The tower, once a proud silhouette against the sky, was now shown in fragmented images. Documents spread across tables, legal arguments, closed doors, long corridors where secrets had walked for years. The world watched not a single dramatic fall, but a slow and grinding unraveling. It did not happen in a single night. There was no sudden crack of thunder, an instant collapse. Instead, there were days that looked, at first glance, like any other. Days of scrolling news feeds, of scrolling comment sections, of scrolling past yet another headline that felt both shocking and strangely familiar. The foundation was moving. Supporters felt betrayed, or persecuted, or embattled. Opponents felt vindicated, or enraged, or impatient. The nation itself seemed to fracture down lines that did not appear overnight, but had long been etched into its soul lines of class, race, belief, memory. Old wounds reopened. New ones were carved. Families argued across dinner tables. Friendships cooled. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. It was not just a leader under judgment. It was a house divided, shaking on its own fragile base. And somewhere in the midst of that turbulence, some began to remember a reading from a distant year, in a quiet room by the sea. A builder of towers, a rise through the will of the people. A fall not from an enemy's sword, but from within, from truths that could no longer remain buried. Was it precise, literal, or was it symbolic? A kind of mirror held up to the pattern of human history, repeating in different clothing, under different names. The questions grew louder. Is this what he saw? Is this who he meant? Is this the tower? Finally feeling the sand shift beneath it? Yet the prophecy, as Cayce spoke it, did not stop with the downfall. It did not linger forever on the spectacle of a leader being judged by his own actions. It moved quietly, insistently towards something else. Someone else. Because if the story were only about the fall of a powerful man, it would be just another tale of hubris and consequences, destined to be retold and then forgotten. But Cayce's vision pointed beyond the ruins. to the silhouette of another figure rising not from the heights of gold-clad towers, but from the depths of shared pain. While the world fixated on the spectacle of collapse, the prophecy was already looking at what would come next. In the echo of hearings and headlines, in the roar of arguments and analysis, another sound could barely be heard, a gentler, quieter current moving beneath the surface. People worn down by division began to whisper about something else they longed for. Not another champion for their side, not another voice to shout louder than the rest, but someone or something that could actually heal. A strange fatigue settled over the public soul. Outrage, once exhilarating, began to feel exhausting. Constant conflict, once energizing, began to feel like a weight. Even those who still clung fiercely to their chosen leader began to sense that something essential had been lost. Not in the headlines, but in their own hearts. It was in that exhaustion, that frayed and weary space, that the next part of Cayce's vision waited. He had spoken of a mender. He had spoken of a woman of light. He had spoken of someone whose power was not to dominate, but to restore. The builder's story was never meant to stand alone. It was the first act in a drama written not just for one nation, but for the human spirit itself. The rise, the glory, the fracture, the reckoning, and then, if we were willing to see it, the possibility of something entirely different emerging from the dust. As the house built on sand trembled in the winds of its own making, the question was no longer only, how high can one man rise, but, what will rise after he falls? Somewhere, out of sight of the cameras and beyond the glare of the towers, a different kind of story was beginning to stir. Long before anyone spoke her name, long before a single headline hinted at her emergence, the world seemed to ache in a way that no one could fully articulate. It was an exhaustion that went deeper than politics, deeper than ideology, deeper even than the anger that filled the streets and screens. It was the kind of weariness that settles into the bones of a nation, the sort of collective fatigue that makes people look inward and whisper, surely this cannot be all there is. And it was in that silence, after the chants had faded, after the rallies had thinned, after the tower of the builder shook under the weight of its own contradictions, that something subtle began to stir. Not a roar, not a declaration, but a presence, soft as a footstep on dew-covered earth. Edgar Cayce had seen her decades before anyone breathed her into the realm of possibility. At the time, Gladys Davis did not understand the significance of his words. Few did. The builders of towers were easy to imagine. The world had never lacked ambition. But the mender, the quiet figure who would rise not through force, not through spectacle, but through wounds, seemed almost too gentle, too improbable, to fit into the fierce machinery of human power. And yet, it was precisely that gentleness that would define her. Cayce had spoken of her as though she were shaped by sorrow itself. She bears the scars of her people, he murmured during one reading, and they become her crown. It was a strange image, regal, yet humble, pain, yet purpose, a symbol of triumph forged not through conquest, but through endurance. He described her origins not as a line of privilege, but as a lineage marked by hardship, a childhood touched by struggle, a youth spent watching others hurt, an adulthood carved by losses that never fully healed, but instead deepened her capacity to understand the suffering of others. Every wound became a lesson, every trial became a seed of compassion. She rises, Cayce said, because she knows what it is to fall. The irony, of course, was that while the builder towered above the crowd bathed in lights, celebrated or condemned by millions, she moved among them unseen. She was not a public figure. She was not a celebrity. She did not belong to any dynasty of influence. In the prophecy, she did not appear in grand halls or in the glitter of cameras. Instead, she appeared in places most of society overlooked, in fields where laborers worked quietly under the sun, in classrooms where teachers arranged chairs for students who might never know their names, in homes where caregivers tended to the frail and forgotten with hands that never trembled. Cayce saw her walking through these humble spaces, collecting fragments of pain and stitching them together into something whole. It was not the work of a ruler, it was the work of a healer. He called her the mender, not savior, not queen, not conqueror, just the one who mends. And he said she would rise not when the world was triumphant, but when it was fractured, when the nation's spirit felt splintered, when each group clung to their own truth as though it were a shield. People would yearn for justice, he said, but would be uncertain of what justice truly meant. In that confusion, she would be like a lantern in deep fog, subtle, but unmistakable to those ready for its light. The most extraordinary part of Cayce's vision was not the clarity with which he described her character, but the timing of her arrival. He did not place her emergence in an age of stability, but at the exact moment of national exhaustion, when the builder's tower leaned, when trust in institutions eroded, when anger burned itself down to embers and left behind a hollow quiet. That quiet, Cayce said, was her doorway. She would step into it not with fanfare, but with presence, the kind of presence that quiets a room without trying. He said that when she finally spoke, her voice would not thunder, it would not command, it would not promise power or victory. Instead, it would settle over people like a warm cloth laid over a feverish brook, coming, steadying, reminding them of something they had forgotten, that unity is not the absence of conflict but the choice to see oneself in another. She brings remembrance, Cayce whispered, as though reciting words from another realm. She awakens the sense of belonging. In the prophecy, she does not divide. She gathers, she does not accuse. She listens, she does not stir chaos. She soothes it sometimes with nothing more than her presence, other times with truths spoken so gently that they disarm even the most hardened hearts. But Cayce also warned that the powerful would not understand her. Those who built their lives on authority and dominance would dismiss her, not recognizing the luminous strength hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. They would underestimate her, mock her, perhaps even attempt to silence her. Yet it would not matter, because she did not rise by their permission. She rose by necessity, for the weary, for the searching, for the ones who no longer trusted the noise of the world and longed for a different kind of leadership, one rooted not in conquest but in compassion. And as she walked her destined path, people would begin to feel something shift in themselves. Not suddenly, but gradually. Like frost thawing from the edges of a frozen river, the bitterness they had carried would soften, the suspicion they had nurtured would loosen its grip. The desire to fight, to accuse, to dominate, would give way not because the external world had changed, but because they themselves had. Cayce's vision suggested that her influence would be less about policy and more about the unseen realm of the heart. She would remind people not of what they must defeat, but of what they could restore. The prophecy described her stepping into a moment of profound national confusion, yet she herself would be a source of clarity, not clarity of strategy or ideology, but clarity of spirit, the kind that reawakens dormant empathy and reignites the recognition that beyond all labels, wounds, and walls, people share the same fragile humanity. In this sense, she would not only heal the nation, she would heal its memory. She would help it remember what it had once hoped to be. And when pressed about where she would come from, Cayce never offered a name, never gave a birthplace, never identified a specific role she would occupy. Her rise, he insisted, would not be predictable, because it would not follow the paths of traditional power. She rises, he said, from the people, perhaps from the ones who had suffered, perhaps from the ones who had been ignored, perhaps from the ones who had lost much, but refused to lose themselves. Whoever she was, she would step forward not through ambition, but through calling, not to claim authority, but to serve. And through her, the prophecy hinted, a new pattern of leadership would emerge. When the world had forgotten, it needed. The builder's fall was necessary, but the mender's rise was inevitable. And somewhere unseen, somewhere perhaps closer than anyone realized, the woman of light began to walk toward her appointed time. There comes a moment in every civilization when the structures it built, both physical and invisible, begin to tremble beneath the weight of their own contradictions. Edgar Cayce spoke of such a moment not as a single catastrophe, not as an event marked on a calendar, but as an era, a slow unweaving, a deep reckoning, a time when humanity would be forced to confront everything it had ignored, denied, or buried beneath the glitter of its ambitions. He called it the Age of Reckoning. And as the prophecy unfolds, the world begins to look eerily familiar. At first, the tremors are subtle, not earthquakes that split the ground, but fractures running across the collective conscience. People stop trusting the voices that once guided them. Institutions that once felt immovable begin to falter. Old promises feel hollow. The rituals of civic life become strained, as though everyone is reciting lines from a play whose ending no longer makes sense. Cayce saw this long before anyone living today was born. He described a time when structures built on pride and hubris, the towers of the builder's age, would begin to crack, not because enemies attacked them, but because truth, long suppressed, rose like water beneath their foundations. He spoke of gold losing its luster, fortunes turning to dust, and the things people once clung to suddenly slipping through their fingers as though they were made of smoke. He spoke of chaos but also of revelation. In his vision, the sky was alive with fire and thunder, a poetic image that might once have seemed fantastical, but now feels strangely resonant. Lightning-fast communication, screens glowing in the night, a constant storm of noise and information, unrelenting and overwhelming. Humanity, connected by wires and signals, yet more divided than ever. We speak across oceans instantly. We argue across continents in a heartbeat. We shout through devices that carry our outrage as easily as they carry our laughter. But in all that commotion, Cayce warned, the quiet voice of the spirit becomes harder to hear. People wander through this era as though moving through fog, each convinced that their perspective is the only true one, each certain that the other side is blind. Anger becomes its own currency. Certainty becomes a shield. And though the world feels full of noise, full of opinion, full of conflict, it is empty in a deeper, more haunting way. Even families are not spared. He spoke of brother turning against brother, homes divided not by walls, but by worldviews. At dinner tables, tension simmers, conversations turn brittle, shared memories become battlegrounds. This is the reckoning, not a punishment, a mirror. Into this mirror, humanity is forced to look hand. The reflection is unsettling. But even as the turmoil intensifies, the prophecy shifts. Like dawn breaking behind storm clouds, another image begins to take shape. The reckoning, Cayce insisted, is not the end. It is the clearing of the old, the shedding of illusions, the collapse of what could never bear its own weight. And after this clearing comes something else. The Age of Renewal. But renewal does not arrive with trumpets or declarations. It creeps in quietly, like the first rays of morning sliding across a dark room. It begins in unremarkable places. Fields where farmers kneel to examine the soil. Small classrooms where teachers dust chalk from their hands, despite shrinking resources. Kitchens where caregivers prepare a simple meal for those who cannot care for themselves. These moments, humble, unglamorous, easily overlooked, are the first signs of a world slowly remembering itself. From the wreckage of broken trust, new forms of connection begin to bloom. It is not unity through victory or domination, but unity through recognition. The realization that every person, no matter how loud or quiet their beliefs, carries the same fragile longing to be seen, to belong, to matter. In the Age of Renewal, Cayce said, people would look at one another differently. Suspicion would not vanish overnight, but little by little, empathy would seep back into places where bitterness once ruled. Neighbors who had stopped speaking might exchange a glance of shared weariness. Strangers might pause before judging. Families might decide that love is more important than winning arguments. The walls of distrust, solid, cold, and towering, would begin to soften. And then, astonishingly, they would begin to fall. Not through force, through understanding. Cayce described a world where the old boundaries, mine and yours, us and them, lose their power. Walls that once separated communities transform into bridges. Resources, once hoarded, become shared. Leadership shifts. Authority is no longer seized by ambition, but entrusted to those who earn it through service and humility. In this renewed world, science and spirituality, two realms long thought incompatible, draw nearer to each other. Cayce foresaw a time when researchers and spiritual seekers would sit together, not to debate superiority, but to compare notes on the same vast mystery, the nature of existence. The universe becomes not a battlefield of ideas, but a tapestry woven from both reason and reverence. Amid this awakening stands the Mender, the woman of light. Her role is not to dominate the new era, but to shepherd it gently. She becomes a guidepost, not by authority, but by example. Her influence flows not from power, but from a resonance that people feel without needing to explain. She inspires ordinary individuals to rediscover the extraordinary possibilities tucked inside their own hearts. When her path eventually completes, she does not leave a vacuum. She leaves a Lagosha seed planted in countless souls. A living memory of what compassion looks like when embodied fully. A quiet reminder that healing is not a singular act, but a way of being. And through that legacy, the Age of Renewal continues long after her presence fades from public view. The storms calm, the earth breathes more gently. Humanity, slowly, with trembling steps, finds its way back to itself. The reckoning was necessary. The renewal was promised. Now the question becomes, who will choose to carry its light forward? Because according to Cayce, renewal is not merely an era unfolding across the world. It is a choice one each soul must make in the silent chambers of their own heart. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when a prophecy stops being a story from the past and becomes a mirror held up to the present. For Edgar Cayce, that moment was always meant to arrive in an age not defined by dates, but by decisions. An age marked not by celestial alignments, but by the inner shift of human souls standing together at a threshold. That threshold is now. We have entered a time when the world feels suspended between endings and beginnings. The echoes of the Builder's rise still reverberate through headlines and histories being written in real time. The fractures of the nation, like fine cracks in glass, stretch from one coast to another. The debates, the trials, the accusations, all of them swirl into a whirlwind that seems to crawl under the skin of daily life. And yet, beneath that noise, there is a deeper hum. A subtle vibration, a feeling that something else is approaching, something foretold long before anyone living today took their first breath. Cayce warned that when the tower trembles, when the builder is judged not by enemies but by his own reflection, the world will find itself pulled toward a crossroads. Not a crossroads of victory or defeat, but of direction, of identity. A place where humanity must ask, what kind of people are we becoming? What kind of future do we dare to shape? And who are we waiting for to lead us into it? In this suspended moment, the prophecy whispers its truth. That the downfall of a single leader is not the heart of the message. His rise and fall are but the first act, the opening movement of a larger spiritual cycle written into the fabric of eras. Because the fall of the builder is not the conclusion, it is the clearing of the stage, and from that cleared space, a presence steps forward, not with spectacle, not with thunder, not with proclamations, but with light. Cayce's woman of light, the Mender he described in quiet trance, belongs to this moment of choice. She is not the architect of the crossroads, but the guide who helps people see it for what it is. Her role is not to seize control of a shattered world, but to help souls remember that it can be mended. She rises, Cayce said, when the world is most exhausted. When people have fought for so long, they no longer remember why they began. When the outrage that once fueled them becomes a weight rather than a fire. When families wear the bruises of battles fought with words sharper than knives. When the hopeful and the disillusioned both realize they are standing in the same rubble. It is then, in that collective exhale of weariness, that the Mender's presence begins to matter. not as a political figure, not as a savior, but as the embodiment of a different path. Cayce never described her taking a throne. He never placed her behind a desk or under dazzling lights. He did not speak of her leading armies or winning debates. Instead, he spoke of her walking softly, carrying wounds that had been transformed into wisdom, extending a compassion that made the furious grow quiet without knowing why. And perhaps that is the key. She does not conquer the world. She heals the world. And in doing so, she reveals a forgotten truth. Power is not what changes history. Healing is. This is where the prophecy turns toward us. Cayce's final message woven through his readings like a silver thread was that the future does not belong to rulers alone. It belongs to the collective soul of humanity. He insisted that the age of renewal is not brought about by one figure's rise, but by the choices of countless individuals who decide, quietly but decisively, that they will no longer rebuild the same fragile towers of pride. He warned that history repeats not because fate demands it, but because people do not recognize their moment of choice when it arrives. And so he asked, through time, through trance, through the fragile pages, Gladys recorded whether we would be able to see ourselves clearly when that moment came. Would we cling to the symbols of the past, even as they crumble in our hands? Would we rebuild the same structures of division, hoping for a different outcome? Would we wait for another builder, louder or taller than the last? Or would we choose the path of the mender? That path is slower, softer, less glamorous. It does not offer the satisfaction of decisive victories or the thrill of righteous outrage. It asks more of us. It requires patience, humility, and the courage to admit that the storms raging outside reflect storms that have long raged within. It requires us to lay down our certainties and pick up our shared humanity. This Cayce believed is the turning point. Not the tower's fall, not the mender's rise, but our choice made in the stillness of the present about who we will be as the new era dawns. And perhaps that is why you feel a strange tug in your chest as you listen to these words. A recognition not of the drama of prophecy, but of its invitation. Because somewhere within you, a quiet voice is already responding. A part of you knows that you, too, stand at this crossroads. That the age unfolding now is not something to wait for, it is something to participate in. Cayce insisted the age of renewal begins with a single heart, choosing compassion over resentment. One soul deciding to mend rather than divide. One voice choosing gentleness over fury, truth over spectacle, grace over pride. One light, however small, lit in the darkness. And when enough lights are lit, the dawn comes. Not because we demanded it, but because we made room for it. This is where the prophecy becomes personal. You are not merely a witness to this unfolding. You are a thread in its tapestry. You are a bearer of its light. You are part of the renewal it foretells. If these words resonate with something deep within you, something ancient, something weary, something hopeful, then perhaps the prophecy was not only about leaders and eras, but about you. Before this moment slips past, let its meaning root itself in your spirit. Help keep the quiet flame burning. Help the message find others who are searching. Help ensure the light does not fade in a world that desperately needs it. Like, share, subscribe, yes, those actions help. But more importantly, let them be symbols of a deeper choice. The decision to amplify truth, to protect hope, to join the quiet uprising of menders who are already at work. Because the age of renewal is not merely approaching. It is already herein, the choices we make, and the paths we take, in the courage we summon to carry light into a world trembling on the edge of transformation. And if we choose it together, the dawn will not only come, it will stay.